Okay, so this is the last lecture. We're talking about humans in space. So manned space missions of the past, mostly. We're going to do a big history of Apollo, which is the moon mission. We're going to talk a little bit about the space shuttle, some of the Russian programs, and a little bit on Mercury and Gemini, which were the predecessors to Apollo. Anyone know who the first human in space was? Russian cosmonaut, Soviet? Yuri Gagarin, yeah. Actually, April 12th was the anniversary of that, 52nd anniversary this April 12th. So humans have been in space for 52 years now. This was his spacecraft, Vostok. It looks like a diving bell. So it's just basically a tin can floating in space. That's Yuri Gagarin there. CCCP is Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Russian. And this is the instruments he had. He had a little bit of a gyroscope with the planet on it, altimeter, sort of aircraft type instruments. But one of the things about the Russian program is they weren't allowed to touch any of the buttons. They were locked in the capsule and it was all automated. He actually didn't do anything for the whole flight. He was simply a passenger. This is completely different from how the Americans did it. Alan Shepard, when he went into space, he was the first American in space. A few months later, the American program had all the astronauts pressing buttons because they sold it to the press, sold it to the public, sold it to the world as these people are adventurers and they're pioneers and they're going out and flying these things like pilots. The Americans even had a program to fly rockets off the launch pad with a joystick, which sounds crazy, and we would never do something like that today because humans just can't react fast enough. But with the Russians, it was about automation and technology, and it was a showcase. The whole space program was a showcase of their advanced technology. It actually came out of the ballistic missile program. So the only reason we have a space program at all is because of the Cold War. In World War II, Germany developed V-2s, which are the first ballistic missiles. And after the war, the Americans and Soviets occupied Germany, and they each took some of the rocket scientists and some of the components of the rockets to disassemble and recreate and start their own space program. But it was actually only to deliver nuclear payloads. And the reason why the Russians were first was because they were much more interested in developing rockets. Because the American Air Force was so strong that the Russians would have no chance of delivering a nuclear weapon to the United States, except on a ballistic missile, which can't be intercepted. So instead of building thousands of bombers to compete with the Americans directly, they chose to develop these rockets which could deliver nuclear weapons to the United States without being intercepted. And then someone thought, hey, since we have these ballistic missiles, let's try putting just a payload on it, a satellite on it. So that was Sputnik. The first satellite was just a publicity stunt, really, at the last minute. And then they thought, oh, well, you know, we can send a human into space. So that's not that much harder. We just get a bigger spaceship and send a human into space and then recover them. So the Soviets were first to do that. The Americans were a little bit later with the Mercury program, which was a single capsule. It was a Mercury Redstone was the first rocket, and later they used a Mercury Atlas. They had 7. They were called the first 7. And Project Mercury is basically just almost like a little bullet with a single person in it. And it was a very simple spacecraft that would just follow a single trajectory and then come back down. And it was about 5 minutes in space. It had a parachute and attitude stabilizers, and that's about it. It really went over a bit of the Atlantic Ocean and came down in the middle of the Atlantic. It launched from Florida. So it was a really simple spacecraft, and they did this 7 times. Actually, I think they may have done it 6 times. One of them had a problem. Deke Slayton, I think, had a heart problem, and maybe he didn't fly. The first 2 were suborbital flights, so they just ballistic trajectory. So if you have Earth here, and Florida is down here, that's Mexico, etc., and Europe's over here. Basically what they did is they launched from Florida and came down here. So it wasn't enough velocity to get into orbit. But then the later ones in Mercury did do full orbits of the Earth. The Yuri Gagarin's flight was an orbit, actually, several orbits. So it was an orbital flight. And it was actually before the American Project Mercury as well. They did launch a chimp first, though, chimpanzee, and a monkey, I think. What was the animal in space? No, it wasn't, actually. That's a trick question. Most people think it's a dog. It was a fruit fly, but dog was the first animal in orbit, and it was maybe the first mammal in space, and it was the first widely publicized, but they actually ran some science experiments with flies and stuff like that earlier on. in space. Then Gemini was the next American program, and the purpose of Gemini was to prepare for Apollo. By the time they launched Gemini, they knew that they were trying to go to the moon. And so Gemini was a technology demonstrator. So each of the missions was to demonstrate one key technology that they knew they would need for Apollo. This is the orbital rendezvous mission. So you can see like there's a little orbit thing if you look closely. Then there's this Agena. Agena is Air Force rocket, and they would actually link up with that rocket in space. Because one of the things they needed to do for Apollo was actually link up, rendezvous with another spacecraft in orbit. And that's really, really hard to do because they're flying in different orbital trajectories. It's not like rendezvousing with two airplanes. It's a really hard thing to do, and they didn't even know it was possible. So one of the Gemini missions proved that. This one, 8 days or bust. This is like a covered wagon, because Gemini was a really small ship. It was basically like a car. And so it was like being locked in a car for 8 days, and they didn't know if someone could, if two people, actually Gemini had 2 people, unlike Mercury, which just had 1. They didn't know if 2 people could survive in space for 8 days. 8 days seems like a long time, and they'd have to survive for at least that long in order to get to the moon and back. And then there's this one with it, which is doing orbital maneuvers. This is the first spacewalk. So they needed to be able to determine if a person can actually get out of the spacecraft. So Mercury, they were just locked in this capsule. But then you need to be able to get in a spacesuit and actually get outside the spacecraft. And so that was the first American mission that did that. The first spacewalk was actually by a Russian also in 1965, which was a few months before this. You recognize a lot of these names here. Conrad, I don't know if you guys know that, P. Conrad, Gordon, Young, Collins. Michael Collins was on Apollo 11. He was the guy that stayed in the ship for the moon landing. You see Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin, who went to school here actually. Buzz Aldrin was in the Aeroastro department at MIT. He did his PhD on orbital rendezvous, which is why they picked him to go to the moon. Lovell, that's the guy from Apollo 13. That's the guy that Tom Hanks plays. Have you seen that movie? Yeah. Conrad again, Schirra, Stafford, Borman, Armstrong, Neil Armstrong, and Scott. Actually, Scott came to talk at our class. I met him. He was one of the guys who was on the moon as well. He was on the geology mission. And then we have Apollo. So Apollo was to get to the moon. And why did we fly Apollo? Space race. Okay, yeah, so it's the context of the Cold War. If there hadn't been a Cold War, if there hadn't been this race with the Russians, it probably would not have happened at all. That's right. And what fraction of this rocket do people go in? Yeah, I guess. I don't know the exact number, but yeah, it's like the very, very, very top. You can see right up here, that is the capsule here. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. So this is the first stage, second stage, third stage. This is actually the departure stage that sends them on a translunar injection. So once it gets into orbit, it still has this, and this stage fires to send them to the moon. So that much. And then in here you have this right here is the service module. We're going to talk about that. And in here you have the lunar lander as well. So how do we get to the moon? Anyone know what the overall mission architecture is called? Do you fly directly to the moon and land a ship on the moon? No. Okay. So what do you do? Can someone describe it in words? Yeah, you haven't.
We have like sun, like atmosphere. It doesn't have atmosphere. It's like in orbit around the moon.
Yep.
It's like a thing, this lander thing that like.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So this is Earth, and this is Moon, and we go into orbit of Earth, and then we send our ship. That's the upper stage. We ditch that upper stage, and so that's the top of that Saturn V. The top stage there. We ditch that, falls back to Earth. Then we send 3 ships actually to the moon. This is the service module. This is the command module. These are probably too small. And this is the lunar lander, LEM. Yeah. So there's 3 ships actually that go to the moon. They're all attached together. And in fact, interestingly, this one is actually stuffed inside the upper stage here backwards. So what they had to do is actually detach from the upper stage, turn around and pick it up and attach it to the front of the ship, because they can't have anything behind the service module. That's where the engine is. They had to go out into space, turn around, go and pick it up, and then pull it out. and then launch. Well, actually, that was after they fired their burn to the moon, because this came with them, I think. The upper stage. Yeah, it would have had to. Yeah, so it's a very small part, and there's a little mini rocket up on top of this, which is actually the escape launch system. So if there was a problem during the launch, that rocket could fire and pull that ship right off as a safety mechanism, and then it could is an abort mechanism. So if there's a problem, the rocket blew up or whatever, I mean, depending on how fast it was, you might be able to trigger that, and it would pull you out. It's like an ejection seat, kind of, that would eject the whole craft. Yeah, then these 3 ships go into orbit of the moon. You have to do a burn to do that, to slow down, go in orbit of the moon. Otherwise, you would actually just come right back. It's called a free return trajectory. Then you go into orbit of the moon, and then so you have all 3 ships in the orbit, and then you send down the lunar lander, and then actually the lunar lander is 2 separate ships, 2 separate pieces. It's ascent stage and descent stage. This has all the rocket engines and fuel that it needs to land on the moon. And then there's a little rocket in here that can kick it back up into space. So the bottom part, this descent stage with the legs and everything, of all the landers that landed on the moon, which is 6 of them, they're still on the moon, right? So we left all these descent stages, but this top piece came back up and rendezvoused here. It attaches here. There's a little airlock that you can go through, go into this command module. So this is the command module. This is one that came back to Earth. I think it's Apollo 14, it says. You can see it's all burned up from the re-entry through the atmosphere. There's a lot of heat generated. And there's tiles on it. They have a Gemini module at the Museum of Science, actually, in Boston. So you can see one of those, but I don't think they have an Apollo one there. But this is the service module, and notice the heat shield is behind here. No one goes back here. This is actually just oxygen, fuel, consumables, storage, radio, everything like that, thrusters. You see these little thrusters here. This is basically just all their consumables and fuel and everything. Like in Apollo 13, they had a problem on one of these side panels, and part of the service module blew out. And this engine wasn't working, and they had to actually use this engine to get back. So that's Apollo. It's 3 separate ships. We're going to look a little bit more in detail about that. Actually, before we go there, I want to talk about Rendezvous a little bit. I'm going to show you a video clip, because the reason why Neil Armstrong was selected to be the person to command the mission to the moon was because of his performance in one of the Gemini missions. So this is from the Earth to the moon. This is one of the orbital rendezvous missions of Gemini.
Right, we are docked with the Agena. It's really
Oh, Dave Scott, that's the guy that came and talked to our class.
Roger, Dave. Hey, congratulations. This is real good. You can't have a thrill on that we have up here. We have you at loss of signal in seconds. We'll fly over CSQ.
So they've rendezvoused with an Agena rocket.
Letters LOS stand for loss of signal.
So they had a malfunction in the thruster on the Agena, and it started spinning the whole spacecraft because one of the thrusters would constantly fire on the same side.
We're in a bank.
Plus 30 degrees. How was this?
We shouldn't be moving like this.
Okay, I can't control it. Shut down the Agena.
I did. Command 400. It's down.
What the hell is this? My rate is picking up. It's just getting worse.
Let's hope it's something wrong with the Agena.
We better disengage. You ready?
Yes, sir.
Doc. Can't stop it, Dave. You want me to go to try?
I got it. Man, what is this?
CSQ Capcom. We have serious problems here. We're tumbling in over it. We're separated from the Agena. We're rolling out.
But we can't turn anything off. We are continuously increasing left roll. CSQ flight.
Go ahead, bud.
Did he say he could not turn the Agena off?
No, he said that he's separated from the Agena and is in a roll and he can't stop. announcement. His brake pressure is down to 0. Gemini 8 CSQ. We're on a final left roll here.
We can't turn the ohms off and we can't fire. The ohms system down.
OMS is orbital maneuvering system, which is the thrusters.
I'll shut it down.
Did I hear a stuck hand controller?
Affirmative, Flight. We can't seem to get any valid data here. They're in a pretty violent tumble.
What about the Aegina?
Flight, Sergeant.
Go ahead.
That roll's too violent. There's a danger of tunnel vision with the possibility of blacking out.
We can't take much more of this. Not there. All we have left is the re-entry control system there.
We bring up the RCS, they'll abort the mission.
Much choice here.
So that's a bigger engine, basically. They have two sets of engines in space. RCS. That's the one that's supposed to be used for re-entry.
Okay, we're regaining control of the spacecraft slowly in RCS direct. We're pulsing the RCS pretty slowly here, trying to kill our rolling.
Understand, Gemini? We show you maneuvering at your RCS. That's approved.
Alright, they brought up the RCS, and the flight's over. That's mission rules. We gotta bring them in.
Okay, so they actually aborted the flight early because of the problem. They had a problem with the orbiting maneuvering system, which wouldn't react to automatic control. It was causing it to keep firing. So they started in a roll, so they brought up the bigger engine, the reaction control system. It's actually called the reaction control system on the space shuttle. I don't know if it's supposed to be called the re-entry control system on there, or if they made a mistake. Anyway, so they used that to stop the roll that was created by the orbital maneuvering system. So this is a comparison of the sizes. So think about this. They're stuck in this little craft that's basically this big compared to a human for a week at a time. It's about 3 days there, 3 days back, and then they're in the lunar module for some time. Incidentally, the lunar module, they're standing up in it when they land. They never actually sit down. There's no seats in it at all, and that's really just to save weight and to give them better visibility. There's a really good episode on the design of the lunar module too in that series. I highly recommend it. So this is the launch abort system. This is the command module. This is up on top of that stack. And this is the upper stage that goes with them to the moon, that sends them to the moon. This is how the lunar module is tucked in. And the service module and command module pop off once it gets to space. They turn around and pick up the lunar module. That's what the interior looks like of the command module. It's got 3 seats and not so much room to move around in. Pardon me?
Also like pointy bird at the top.
What, this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the launch abort system. It's a rocket that is only used in the case of an abort. It's like the ejection seat. So if there's a problem during launch, that thing will fire and take this, probably just this part actually, take it right off the rocket and send them safely back down. That's the idea anyway. In many cases, it's doubtful whether it would be fast enough to actually work, depending on what happened. Okay, let's talk about different parts of it. It's got parachutes for coming down. It's got a docking mechanism for docking with the lunar module. The crew obviously goes in there. It's got a hatch to enter and come out when it lands in the ocean to be recovered. Their power actually comes from a fuel cell, which converts hydrogen and oxygen into electricity and water. They've got radiators for getting rid of heat. They've got this reaction control system assembly that's for entering into orbit and larger maneuvers. They've got cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen storage. So the hydrogen and oxygen is both for the engine, and the oxygen is also for breathing. And that was one of the things that blew up in Apollo 13. They lost, I think, 2 out of 3 oxygen tanks. So they were short on oxygen and fuel as well, and it was leaking out. And this is environmental control system, so that's life support system. These are the antenna, so that's for communicating with Earth. Okay, so this is the command module, and it's got connectors for pressure suit, so if you need to connect your spacesuit. So they've got environmental controls, oxygen and temperature control panels, water supply access, clocks and timers, control panels, rate and attitude gyros, that's for attitude control, servo assembly for guidance and communication, command module computer, CO2 absorber cartridge, so that's for old expended cartridges. That was one of the things they had in Apollo 13. Actually, lack of oxygen is not the thing that would probably kill you. It's too much carbon dioxide in the air, because if it goes up above 1% or something, it becomes really toxic. So they have carbon fiber cartridges that scrub the air, that absorb the carbon dioxide as it passes through. And that was one of the things, they didn't have enough of those during Apollo 13. So they ended up modifying the ones from the lunar module as well. Guidance communications optics, or guidance and control optics. So this one, they actually had this star scanner telescope that the astronauts would make readings of the stars manually. So they'd actually look at this set of binoculars basically at the stars and correct the course based on their position. Because if you can tell where the stars are relative to your spacecraft, you can tell which direction you're pointing, right? And so they'd actually take sites, and the guidance computer was actually designed here at Draper, so right next door actually from MIT. It was part of MIT at the time. That's where they built the guidance computer, and it's one of the first digital computers in the world. It was actually for Apollo. And they used to train the astronauts to do this on the roof of MIT and Draper. So right here is where they trained them to take the readings, the star site readings, to determine where they were. Waste management control panel, interesting word. I think that they probably use plastic bags. So the lunar module, they actually stood up, and as I said, it's two separate spacecraft. It's a descent stage and an ascent stage, so they would actually leave this bottom one on the moon. This was everything you need to get down, and then this was where you live and everything you need to get back up. And so like EVA antenna, EVA is extravehicular activity, so that's what they'd use for communication, like the radio on the moon, back to the spacecraft, back to Earth. This is the antenna that would communicate directly back with Earth. This is a radar antenna for rendezvousing with the command module when they went back up. So it shoots a radar beam that bounces back, and it tells you how far you are from the other spacecraft and how fast you're closing. They use that right now for every kind of spacecraft rendezvous and docking now with the International Space Station. There's a ladder you come down. The rover was stored under here for the missions that they had them, which was I think the last 3. So this hatch is actually the one that you would access the command module with, the other spacecraft, so you go in between the two. In Apollo 13, they used this one as a lifeboat because they weren't planning to be in both spacecraft for the full amount of time. So they needed access to the facilities from this one. Okay, so this is where they would actually land on the moon. They had 2 triangular windows, and they'd actually stand up and kind of look down through those triangular windows. And they used a hand controller and like a joystick, just as you saw in the movie, to actually control the thrusters.